Live from New London, Connecticut, and the historic Garde Arts Center, southeastern Connecticut's home for the performing arts, welcome to the national kickoff of The Dynasty, with New York Times bestselling author Jeff Benedict in conversation with author and NBC Boston sports anchor Michael Holley.
All right, I guess it's showtime. Welcome, everybody. What's up, Southeastern Connecticut? I know I'm coming to you from my wife's office right here in Boston, Massachusetts, but what an honor it is for me to be here tonight. I wish I could be with you in person, with you guys. I wish we were all here. Jeff Benedict, who is one of my favorite artists. I use that word intentionally, and one of my favorite people, The Dynasty. I've had an opportunity to read this book. I hope you guys have too. It is an amazing read. And I've said this before. I'm going to say it publicly. It is the best Patriots book that I have read. And I've read a few Patriots books. So without further ado, we got a fun night lined up for you. I don't want to keep you guys waiting. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the author of The Dynasty, New York Times best-selling author, Jeff Benedict.
Well, first of all, Michael, I can't thank you enough for joining us here in Southeastern Connecticut. Someone who's written 3 books about the Patriots and Teddy Bruschi's book for him. It's an honor for me to have someone that I consider a friend and a pioneer when it comes to writing about the Patriots. The first 3 books I read when I started this project were books that you wrote. And I'm really thrilled about introducing you to all these people in Southeastern Connecticut, where I'm from and where I've lived most of my life. And thrilled tonight to be actually at the Garde where this book was written. Grateful to the folks at the Garde who have given me an office and a place to work and write. And I just can't think of a better place to start this off. So let's get going.
Yeah, let's get going, Jeff. This is a Broadway performance here. We got a Broadway show to do tonight. And let's just start off with this. The book is called The Dynasty, and I think everybody understands why it's called The Dynasty. The Patriots have appeared in 9 Super Bowls. They've won 6 of them, 6-3 in Super Bowls. They've won 17 of the last 19 AFC East titles. They haven't had a losing season since 2000. So even when they've missed the playoffs, they missed it in 2008, they were 11-5. They missed it in 2002. They were 9-7, and they lost the division on the 3rd tiebreaker. This clearly, across the board, they got a Hall of Fame coach in Bill Belichick. They had a Hall of Fame quarterback. Still weird for me to say, Jeff, and Tom Brady, and certainly going to be a Hall of Fame owner in Robert Kraft. So just let's talk about why you chose this subject. Let's tell us about that.
You know, I think I could trace this, Michael, all the way back to a night at the end of the 2007 season. It was the last game of the regular season. The Patriots were at Giants Stadium to play New York. They were 15-0, and they were losing late in the game. And Brady threw this magical touchdown pass to Randy Moss that silenced almost 80,000 people in Giants Stadium. And I was watching that game like millions of Americans on TV and thinking to myself just in that moment, there's something going on here bigger than football. There's something about this franchise. There's like an aura around them. They're doing things that just have never been done. And I was thinking then, this is a story it's a little bit bigger than just the game itself. I wasn't thinking about writing a book at that point, but that's when I started looking at this team differently. And then probably by the time of Deflategate, that's when I started thinking more like it would really be great to do a book about this dynasty. By 2018, when I actually got serious about doing it, of course, they'd now won 5 Super Bowls. And to me, it's just that you're looking at a team that's in the same conversation as the Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio Yankees or the Bill Russell Celtics. It's that kind of franchise. They've been that dominant for 20 years. And I just wanted to come into it a little differently, Michael, than I think anyone had done before, which was, I mean, you did a great book on Belichick and Brady. I wanted to come at this through the ownership. I wanted to sort of start at the top and write from the top down. And I wanted to be able to write it from the inside out as well. And so it was to take Kraft's ownership and just start looking from the beginning. How did he get this franchise? What was the path to acquiring the team? And then I figured I would just start to build from there.
Yeah, and I think your approach is a really good one. I was trying to think along with you. This is even before talking with you, Jeff, about this project. Because when I heard that there's this book out, there's this book going to be coming out called The Dynasty, I said, okay, I wonder what the approach is going to be. And I heard it was Jeff Benedict. I said, okay, I know it's going to be thorough because Jeff Benedict leaves no stone unturned, everybody. When he approaches a book project, he gets all the way in there. He's really an inspiration for all of us. Even his colleagues as authors, really. He works as hard as anybody, if not harder than anybody. So I said, all right, David Halberstam did something with Belichick. I did something with Belichick. Tom Brady has Tom versus Time, and Charlie Pierce did something on Tom Brady, and I know Gary Myers did Brady and Manning. So there's an opening there, though. Nobody has done the ownership angle, and it's brilliant. It really is. It was there, Jeff. I got to admit, it was there hiding in plain sight for all of us, and you tapped it. You got
That's
it.
a great.
What?
No, you go ahead. Finish. Well, I love your expression, hiding in plain sight, because what it brings to mind is something I was actually talking about earlier today. Is throughout the Dynasty, and you know this because we've been through this, but there are all these characters that surface in the Dynasty book that have never been interviewed before. And so, I mean, obviously Robert Kraft has been interviewed before, but like you said, no one's really taken it and let's try to use him as a primary vehicle to tell an epic story. But along the way, who else can we put in the car with him? And so you start picking up people like team doctors that have never been interviewed before, physicians, people that work security for the team, someone who is the chief financial officer, attorneys who've worked for the organization, all these, or maybe even a player like a punter named Lee Johnson that nobody even remembers, but Lee Johnson was the punter for the Patriots when Tom Brady was drafted, and they ended up being locker mates. And so I wanted to talk to Lee because I thought there could be insights from Lee Johnson that are new and interesting and different, because Lee was about to retire when Tom was a rookie, and Lee had a big family, lots of kids. He was Steve Young's roommate in college, who was Tom Brady's idol. So I just thought there might be interesting things there, and it turned out it was more than interesting. It was fascinating. These kinds of characters who've never been asked to talk before, I tried to find as many of those people as I could, and every one of those folks had these incredible string of stories that, you know, I wanted to bring into my narrative.
You know, Jeff Benedict, allow me to be Professor Holley here for a second. For those journalism students out there, I always tell them, when there's a team meeting, don't be so starstruck that you need to talk to the star to find out what happened at the team meeting. Let's say there's a team meeting in football. You got 53 guys on the roster. You got a gaggle of coaches. Let's say with the Patriots, they have a smaller coaching staff. Let's say it's about 15. So now we're up to about 68 people. You got trainers and doctors, all these people that Jeff just mentioned. Let's say you got 75, 80 people. Those are 80 sources at your disposal. Do not underestimate the power of that. I'm glad to say that. Hear you say that, Jeff. Let me ask you about how you began the book. Really a good scene where you have Drew Bledsoe. At the time, we didn't know, but it turned out well. Drew Bledsoe, alive and healthy, doing great with his wine business out in Washington. But Drew Bledsoe's in a hospital bed. He wakes up. Bill Belichick. He sees and he sees Tom Brady all in his hospital room. And you say, that right there, you have the pillars of a dynasty. Why did you begin the story that way?
Well, I think that, you know, two of the biggest questions that a writer has to answer when they write a book is, how am I going to start and how am I going to end? So how am I going to bring the reader in to the story and how am I going to take them out? And I figured out the beginning to this book long before I started writing, because when I first heard this story, which I initially heard it from Drew Bledsoe, And basically, the story is that Drew Bledsoe suffered a serious injury when he's hit by Mo Lewis in a game. It ruptured one of his arteries, which was bleeding into his lung. And he gets rushed to Mass General, where he ends up in the hands of arguably the best surgeon at the hospital, who, effectively saves his life that night. But it's very touch and go. And for a while, he is under, obviously, while the procedure is going on. When Drew wakes up, he has his wife to his right. She's kind of holding his hand and sitting at the bed. When he looks up to his left, that's when he sees the owner, Robert Kraft, and then he sees Coach Belichick, and then he sees Tommy. That's how Drew referred to him at the time, Tommy, the rookie. And he's a little perplexed, like, why are they there? And I thought this was a tremendous scene because at that moment, nobody in their right mind would have imagined that Drew Bledsoe was staring up at the nucleus of the greatest dynasty in football history, because at that moment, Robert Kraft, as the owner, had never won a championship. Bill Belichick had a career-losing record as a head coach, and Tom Brady had never started a professional football game. So the idea that Bledsoe was seeing the future, and the future was going to be this incredible run, it's just so implausible. And that's why I wanted to open there, because I thought it's a dynamic moment. And plus, to be able to sort of bring the reader into the room and go through the procedure with Drew and that experience, I thought would be just a great way to open.
Let's talk about these three compelling characters that you focused on in this book. Let's start with Robert Kraft. And I said to you yesterday, kind of in passing, when we were doing a little rehearsal, we're doing a little dress rehearsal for our Broadway show tonight. I said, Jeff, I'm so glad that you did this story. Even being in southeastern Connecticut and living in different parts of the country, some might think, well, wait a minute. He's not in Boston all the time. Why wouldn't a Boston writer do this? And I said, no, Jeff, I'm glad you did it, because you are able to be more objective, particularly about Robert Kraft, than a lot of us. I think we all respect Kraft, and we know how smart he is and all the things that he's accomplished, but we probably take it for granted. And you approach him with a fresh set of eyes and a fresh set of ears, and I think you got a Robert Kraft that we haven't seen. So let's talk about Robert Kraft and just what some of your takeaways were from dealing with him.
I guess for me, Michael, it starts with how I met Robert Kraft, which was by writing him a letter, the old-fashioned way. He doesn't know me from a hole in the wall, and I had never met him. I want to write this book. So I write a letter to the owner and introduce myself. I mean, literally, hi, I'm Jeff Benedict, and I proceeded to tell him a little bit about who I am and what I do. And I let him know in this letter that I wanted to write this book. And at that point, at least in my mind, I knew where I wanted to go. And eventually, he wrote me back. And I mean, it's literally, I got a letter in my mailbox here in Connecticut from him. And as soon as I saw the letter, I knew it was from him, because when I looked at the stationery. And it's interesting to me that that's how our relationship started. It was through writing to each other. And then it transitioned from writing to each other to talking to each other face to face, not me interviewing him. I'm just talking about us meeting and having conversations, getting to know each other. And I look back on those conversations now with a tremendous amount of appreciation for the things we talked about, which had nothing to do with football. We talked about things like each other's families. We talked about our respective religions. These were things that he was interested in about me. And frankly, I was very interested in those things about him, because I just wanted to know him. And not just because he was the owner of this great team, but if I'm going to get to do this book, I really want to know the man who built the enterprise. And I really enjoyed getting to know him in that way before we got down to me composing questions and starting to interview him and do things like that. But along the journey of writing the book, I just developed this great appreciation for who he is as a human being, where he's been in his life, that he's a citizen of the world, that he has such an unusual background compared to other NFL owners. His life had been so rich and diverse before he entered the NFL. And all those things were things that I saw as great assets, not only for becoming a great owner of a football team, but from my perspective, in a selfish way, there was so much to work with as a writer. I mean, it was just like, it was almost unfair, like a gluttony of riches as a writer. And I just thought, wow, there's just so much I can do here with him. And so I was pretty excited very early on about that.
Jeff, I'm glad to hear you mention that, just to find out who he was. And I love going back when people weren't famous and what they were like. We see them now, and we kind of develop this caricature, which has some accuracy, but not completely. Like, people think Robert Kraft grew up rich. He did not. People think Bill Belichick was always like this great figure. He wasn't. I remember hearing a story, like, he used to ride his bike to work in Cleveland. And one time his bike broke down, so he was in the back of like those old Volkswagens, He was kind of crouched in the back, the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. Somebody picked him up and gave him a ride. And when Tom Brady, his rookie year with the Patriots, there was a guy on the roster, training camp roster, named Dave Nugent, who was a tight end. No, it wasn't Dave Nugent. It was Eitzman. Eitzman, a tight end who went to Harvard, and he was the guy getting autograph requests, and Tom Brady was an unknown. He'd stand around as one of his buddies, one of his roommates, got autograph requests. So it was like, we have to remember that they all had these humble beginnings before they became the subjects of the dynasty. And so Robert Kraft, can you just talk about what his upbringing was before he got to this famous status?
Yeah, his upbringing is great. In fact, Michael, you know this, but after that hospital scene which is the prologue for the book, and then I have chapter 1, which is set in 2019. It's Tom Brady's last season, and then chapter 2, I go all the way back to when Kraft is a college student, and that's where I deal with his childhood and his upbringing. I call that chapter Bobby, because Bobby was Robert's nickname when he was a kid. He was Bobby. And I opened that chapter with him walking into a diner after midnight in Boston in the Back Bay with 3 buddies, they're college buddies. And they walk into this diner, and it's in the early 60s. And his buddies are looking at the menu board, and he's looking at a girl. And the girl he's looking at is with another guy. And, Bobby is thinking about, how can I get this girl's phone number? And he really wants to know her. And I open with that because within 24 hours, she has left her boyfriend and is proposing to him that they get married. It's this profound turn of events for him in this. It almost seems like that can't be real. But that's actually just a foreshadowing of what his adult life is going to be like. It's things that you would never imagine. And I think a lot of that stems from the way he was raised. He grew up in a Jewish home where his father was a great religious leader in the community of Brookline, tremendously respected. His mother, not so much. She wasn't really nearly as sort of committed to the faith as the dad was. And Robert learns different things from his mother and from his father. From his mother, he learns his business sense, frugality, and all these things. From his father, he learns about not judging people. He learns about how to accept all kinds of people, his appreciation for diversity. So he gets these different things from his parents. But the one thing he never got from his parents was wealth. They didn't own a home. They didn't even own a car. When Robert wanted to take this woman that he met in the diner, who turns out to be Myra Kraft, on that first date, he had to borrow a car from his uncle to go pick her up to take her out for pizza. And I think that says a lot about how he started. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's a self-made man. And in many respects, that's a nice parallel with Belichick and Brady because they're self-made too. If you compare Tom Brady to Peyton Manning, for example, Peyton Manning is like blue blood NFL. His father played in the NFL and all that. Tom's got none of that. He's got to earn it, and he's got to earn it while everybody thinks he's not good enough. And then Belichick was the guy that everybody said isn't good enough to be a head coach. And Robert saw something in him that everybody else was overlooking, which was he's an incredible teacher. He explains the game in a way that players understand and respond to. He's a motivator. And he was just seeing things from him because Robert would go to practice every day. Unlike most owners, Robert's on the sidelines at practice. He's not saying anything, but he's taking a lot in and seeing in Belichick something that he thought would lead to greatness.
You know, Jeff, I've heard that the guy who was on the date with Myra Kraft, he wants to do a book. How his life took a turn. I'm joking. Okay, I'm joking, everybody. Come on. But Jeff, seriously, can you tell me just your observation of what the relationship is between Robert Kraft and Bill Belichick, and maybe how it's changed from its beginning, and even before Belichick was a head coach with the Patriots, that 1996 season where he was here as an assistant head coach, how it's changed from 96, say, over the years?
So two stories that I would tell that are told in the book that I think they're the formative moments of the Belichick-Kraft relationship. The first one is when Belichick gets fired by the Cleveland Browns. He's a head coach. It doesn't go well. He gets fired, and the Miami Dolphins are about to hire him to be their defensive coordinator. At that time, Bill Parcells is the head coach of the Patriots. There's a fair amount of friction and tension between Bill Parcells and Robert Kraft. Kraft is a new owner. Parcells is the most accomplished coach in the game at the time. Huge personality, big ego. Parcells doesn't want to coach against Belichick. He doesn't want Belichick to go down to Miami and be the defensive coordinator and be coaching against the Patriots 2 times a year. So he goes to Kraft and tries to convince him to hire Belichick to come to New England. And Kraft doesn't see the logic in that because they don't need a defensive coordinator. And Parcells tries to explain to him, look, this guy will help us, yada, yada, yada. So Kraft flies out to Indianapolis where the combine is occurring, and he meets with Belichick. This is the first time that Kraft and Belichick have ever been in each other's company. And to me, this is a really important moment in the story because they meet and they talk for a long time, a few hours. And Kraft is really taken by his knowledge of the game, the way he communicates it. It's apparent he's sort of got a vision of how he would run a football program. So he hires him. He brings him to New England, but he knows he's Parcells' guy. So it's not like they get close that year in 96. He's watching him a lot on the field, coaching and practices, but he's not getting to know him. At the end of that season, the Patriots go to the Super Bowl. They're going to play the Packers. It's clear that this is going to be the end of the road for Parcells. There's just way too much friction between him and Kraft. Kraft knows he's got to hire a new head coach at the end of this, after the Super Bowl. On the last practice before that Super Bowl, Kraft is on the field. This is down in New Orleans, and he sees John Bon Jovi walking around the practice. This is a closed practice. No media, no friends, no family. Why is Bon Jovi there? Well, Bon Jovi's there because he's good friends with Parcells and even better friends with Belichick. So Kraft walks up to Bon Jovi, another guy he's never met, and says, "Tell me about your friend." And Bon Jovi looks at him and goes, "You mean Belichick?" And it's Kraft's like, "Yeah, tell me about him." And so Bon Jovi proceeds to tell him how great of a coach he is. Well, Kraft's already come to that conclusion. He knows that. That's not what he's asking him. He's saying, but tell me about him as a man. And Bon Jovi then does, because he's got a relationship with him that goes back to the Giants. And what's so fascinating about this is that what other owner would consult a rock star when making a decision as monumental about who's going to be your next head coach? But this is what's unique about Robert. the reason he's interested in what Bon Jovi knows is because he knows that he knows something that Robert doesn't know. And so he wants to know. And I saw this from him time and time again, working on this book. He's all about due diligence, getting information, learning from whatever source he can. And he took Bon Jovi's word to the bank. And of course, we all know the story is that eventually he hires him to be the head coach.
You know, Jeff, just hearing you tell that story, you talk about Robert Kraft doing his due diligence and looking at unusual places for information. Well, Bill Belichick is the same way. And to a degree, so is Tom Brady. So Bill Belichick, hired by Robert Kraft, and essentially Bill Belichick hiring Tom Brady on Belichick's birthday way back in 2000. What did you see from that relationship from the very beginning? You have a great story of how Belichick is there in the war room saying, hey, what's going on here? What's going on? What's going on? Why is this guy? Why is he here? To that moment in 2000 to in 2001, Tom Brady takes over and never gives a job up until now.
This is great stuff. Like, if you want to know where the dynasty forms, it's here. It's in the draft in 2000. 2000 is a monumental sea change year for the Patriots franchise. That's the year that Pete Carroll was fired by Kraft, and that's the year that Kraft hired Belichick. Very controversial. Everybody thought that was a bad decision, that Belichick wouldn't be a good coach. Kraft hires him, and then the draft comes up, and Belichick drafts this quarterback out of Michigan that no one else wanted. I mean, we know that because he went through 6 rounds of the draft, almost the 200th pick, and he's still there. And throughout that draft, Belichick kept looking at the fact that Brady was still on the board, and he kept looking around the war room where all the other coaches and scouts are going, why is Tom Brady still on the board? In other words, why hasn't anybody picked him? There's too much value there for a guy as good as Brady to still be here. He looked at all the quarterbacks that had been drafted ahead of him. There'd been 6 of them. And in Belichick's mind, none of them were better than Brady, which is really interesting. And so eventually he picks him. And they already had Drew Bledsoe, who was a superstar and, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And they had 2 solid backups. Now they have a 4th guy. He shows up for camp. He's slow of foot. He's not a physical specimen. His arm isn't like Bledsoe's got a cannon for an arm. Tom doesn't. And you go, what's going on here? But the thing is, what Bill was focused on, again, no one else is looking at this. What he saw was when he watches tape at Michigan, what's Tom doing? He is coming into games late in the game when Michigan's losing, and he's winning games. When the game is on the line, when the clock is running down, when the largest football stadium in college football in Ann Arbor is packed to the gills and everybody's screaming and yelling, Tom Brady looks like he's in his backyard with nobody watching. He's calm, he's cool, he's collective, and he wins. And what's really hard to find in the NFL is quarterbacks who are at their best when the pressure is at the highest. And so that was the set of intangibles that I think Belichick was looking at. Is he's got something that is you can't manufacture, you can't teach a quarterback how to be like this. Well, this was really proven to be true the next year when Drew Bledsoe gets hurt and Brady's forced to play. He plays remarkably well for a guy who'd never played before. But the real proof came when we get to the Super Bowl against the Rams, and the game is, it's the end of the game. The Rams have got all the momentum. The Patriots are tired. There's a little over a minute left. Game is tied, and you go, look, the conventional wisdom is you spike the ball, you kill the clock, run it out, and you play for overtime. That's the safe thing. You don't have a rookie backed up in his own end zone with no timeouts and see if he can drive down the field against one of the top defenses in the league. But Belichick said he trusts him because he knows that Tom is risk avert. He's not going to do dumb things. He's not going to panic and throw an interception. He's not going to take a sack. The things that we take for granted now, he was doing it as a rookie. And you get down to those last few seconds, 12, 11, 10, 9, and everybody's like going crazy because you got to stop the clock. He doesn't have a timeout. And instead of rushing to the line of scrimmage and getting the ball and slamming it into the ground, Tom very calmly takes the snap, calmly tosses it at the ground, waits for it to bounce up, catches it as if the ball is attached to his hand like a yo-yo, and then to top it off, he gently hands it to the official. Kraft is up in the owner's box. Yeah, Kraft's up in the owner's box watching this and going, who does that? It's almost like he's playing without a pulse. And I think that, so now Belichick and Kraft are seeing the same thing. And so it's the beginning of this wonderful partnership between Belichick and Brady, the coach-quarterback relationship forged in that first year.
You know what, Jeff? There's so many aspects of the dynasty itself, and not just the dynasty book, but the dynasty that you're writing about, that are just fun, just to peel apart and to dive into the numbers. For example, just one. I would give somebody out there in our audience, I'll say, I'll give you Tom Brady, age 24 to 32. You can have that Tom Brady, and I'll take Tom Brady, age 33 to 43, and I believe I may have a better quarterback, 33 to 43, than you do at 24 to 32. That's not normal. That's not normal in athletics. That should not happen. I'll tell you another thing that shouldn't happen, Jeff. 3 championships in 4 years at the beginning of the century. And then we go to the end of the century, we get 3 more championships in 5 years. Why do these abnormal things happen? I know it's a big question. But why do these abnormal things happen? These extraordinary abnormal things happen to the New England Patriots?
So I think here is where I'd make an analogy that Michael, that I make in the book. And I think it's really fitting here. In the beginning of the book, and then again at the end when they break up, I make a comparison between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick and Paul McCartney and John Lennon. And I basically compare Belichick to Lennon and Brady to McCartney. And the reason I do that is because you could ask the same question you just asked about the Patriots' magic about the Beatles. Why were the Beatles different than every other band? The Stones, Led Zeppelin, you name it. What distinguished them? It was the magic of McCartney and Lennon. They were the best songwriters in the world. What other band has a third string guy named George Harrison? In any other band, George Harrison would have been the star. In this band, he's third string. And I think that the reason I thought of this analogy is because one day working on this book, I walked into Robert Kraft's New York City apartment that overlooks Central Park. And when you first walk into that apartment, you look across the room and there's these 2 big windows that overlook Central Park. And in between the windows, there's 2 framed pictures of the Beatles, and they're signed by the Beatles. And they were taken when the Beatles came to perform in America the first time on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I asked Robert about that. And we were actually in the building where the Beatles slept while they were in New York. That's where Robert's apartment is. And I think that Robert recognized that he had the Beatles. He knew that Belichick and Brady were otherworldly. They were different than everybody else. Belichick was a genius as a coach, and Brady was an outlier as an athlete. And he had both of them on the same payroll, and they joined the payroll at the same time. And so Robert's a student of history. He knew the Beatles story. They broke up prematurely. They could have stayed together. They could have been like the Rolling Stones. They could have had 50 years. Instead, they had less than 10 because you couldn't keep the 2 stars on the same stage for any longer. And Kraft had a mission, which was to keep Belichick and Brady on the stage together for as long as possible. And so the kind of magic that you're talking about, these things that never happen, Tom Brady playing till he's 43, Bill Belichick approaching 70 and acting like he's 30 in terms of his drive to keep winning. I think that that's because when Kraft saw that he had stars, he learned long before he owned the Patriots, when he owned a team called the Boston Lobsters, a tennis team. The first star that he hired was a young, unheard of tennis player named Martina Navratilova. He was the one who signed her. He paid her what seemed like a king's ransom of money at the time. She filled the arena in Boston. People came to see her because she was a star. And I think Robert never forgot that. When he bought the Patriots, he recognized the value of having stars. And in this case, he had the two biggest ones in the NFL universe on his payroll. And I like to say it's so unfair. If you're a Jet fan or a Giant fan or an Eagles fan or a poor Buffalo Bills fan, this is what you got to deal with. You got Lennon and McCartney on the other sideline, and they're not going away.
That's right. The Patriots have won the last 11 AFC East titles, 17 of the last 19. So you're right, if you're in the AFC East. Now, I know we got some people in southeastern Connecticut and around the web who want to ask some questions. We're going to get to you in about 10 minutes. Couple things. I love your Beatles analogy. And when we talked about this over the summer, you had me on a Beatles kick for about 2 weeks. That's all I was listening to. I appreciate that, my friend. You said the Beatles broke up prematurely. How about Belichick and Brady? Did they break up prematurely?
I don't think so. There's an argument to be made that, maybe they stayed 1 year too long. I think when they won the 6th Super Bowl in Atlanta, beating the Rams, which was just phenomenal. By the way, I agree with you. I think the better Brady is the latter years Brady, winning the last 3 Super Bowls. I think the Patriots played their best football in those latter years. But anyways, I think when they won in Atlanta and beat the Rams for number 6, to me, that was their magnum opus. It doesn't get any better than that. And, the last year was a frustrating year. Again, a nice analogy with the Beatles. It's the same way. But the fact that they lasted 20 years, I mean, look, they just eventually came to the end of the road, and Tom finally got out of the car. And I think that nobody can be dissatisfied or feel disappointed, because we had them, or the league has had them, and the Patriots fans have had them longer than any other franchise has had a duo. The 49ers had Joe Montana and Bill Walsh, for a decade. The Steelers had Terry Bradshaw and Chuck Noll for a decade. The Packers had Bart Starr and Vince Lombardi for around a decade. Patriots fans had these two guys for 2 decades. That's a long time.
Because you're in southeastern Connecticut, you're about 50 miles away from Hartford, I got to ask this. You know where I'm going with this.
I do.
How would this story have changed if Robert Kraft had taken the Patriots to Hartford, had a sweetheart deal on the table from the governor at the time, John Rowland, to move the Patriots from Foxborough? Massachusetts was giving them no love. So move from Massachusetts to Connecticut. How does this story change?
I wondered a lot about that when I was writing that chapter, which is called Dear John. The saga in Connecticut is so misunderstood, because the conventional thinking all these years has been that the Krafts weren't serious about coming to Hartford. They were using Connecticut to leverage a better deal out of Massachusetts. The reality is they had no deal in Massachusetts. That's the whole point here. There was nothing to leverage. They'd been kicked to the curb in Massachusetts. There was nothing to do there. That's why Kraft started talking to Governor Rowland. That begins, by the way, in Montville, Connecticut, a town that's 10 minutes from where I'm sitting right now in New London, because the Krafts own a plant in Montville. And Governor Rowland was running for re-election. He reached out to the Krafts to ask if he could go and basically do a campaign event there. He wanted to visit the plant. So Jonathan Kraft went down to Montville to give the governor the tour of the facility. And it was at the end of the tour that Governor Rowland basically said to Jonathan Kraft, look, I see that the Massachusetts officials are giving you a real hard time up there. I'd be interested in talking to you guys about coming down here. That's how it starts, that sort of innocently. Well, it doesn't take long before it gets to real conversations. a lot of due diligence by the state of Connecticut and by the Patriots, and eventually a real signed agreement, a binding contract, and legislation then gets passed in Connecticut. Money gets appropriated to build a stadium, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a huge deal. And all the while, the Krafts are prohibited from communicating not only with Massachusetts, but with anybody else because they've entered into a contract. And so this was very real. And I think at that point, Massachusetts realized they were really losing the Patriots. Season tickets holders were notified that their season tickets would be honored in Hartford. The Krafts took out a full-page ad in the Boston Globe, basically telling their fans what they were doing. This was for real. And the NFL was panicking because they didn't want to lose the Boston market. And the New York Giants and the New York Jets were complaining vociferously because they didn't want the Patriots to encroach on their market, because most of Connecticut at that time were either Jets and Giants fans. They didn't want the Patriots in Hartford. So there were all these things in the mix, and Roger Goodell really enters my story, the Dynasty, here, because he's the one who gets deputized by the commissioner at the time, Paul Tagliabue, to go up to Boston and see if they could figure out a way to get Massachusetts to basically get their heads out of the sand and do what they had to do to get the Patriots to come back to Foxborough.
Jeff, I want to ask you about this before we turn it over to questions. You're working on this book. You started in 2018, correct?
Yes.
Did you get the sense as you were working, very beginning, first couple of notes taken, did you get the sense that, I'm covering the end of a dynasty? And if not then, when did you start to get a feeling that, this thing, this three-man weave and four-man weave at times, because I don't want to forget Jonathan Kraft, Robert Kraft, Bill Belichick, Tom Brady, is going to dissolve a bit.
Well, great question. And as a prelude to answering it, let me just say, because we haven't said anything about him, Jonathan Kraft to me is, I just can't say how much I enjoyed my interviews with him. This guy, he's really something. And he's like the X factor that nobody knows about. And so I learned a lot from him, and I compare his role to Robert Kraft is basically what Robert Kennedy was to JFK. That's basically the relationship here. And so when did I start to sense it? I would say when it became clear to me was in August of last year, so 2019, the week that Tom Brady was signing his renewal contract, which would clearly give him an out in 1 year, which he would end up exercising. But that August, I interviewed Tom in his suite at the stadium. The stadium was empty. That's actually the opening scene of chapter 1 of this book. It's Tom Brady glancing out at an empty stadium. And I just felt like that I'm not saying that I knew this was going to be his last year, because that would not be a true statement. I'm saying is that I felt like the end is near. And it just felt that way to me.
All right, Jeff, let's get to some questions. I know some people are lined up and really eager to hear what you have to say. You've written a terrific book. The book is called The Dynasty. You see it right there. I love it. Jeff trusted me, and I want to thank you publicly for giving me that trust, because you have some news in there, and a lot of journalists, you throw that raw steak in front of these dogs here, these journalists, and they just say, okay, well, maybe if I just kind of get the news out this way. It requires a lot of trust to give your work to somebody and have them read it. I'm glad you did, and I enjoyed every second of it. So you've written a terrific book.
It was easy to do that, Michael. I literally didn't even think about it with you. So that says more about you than me.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I've learned a lot just from looking at your writing and hearing about your process. So one of the questions, I think it's a great question from Andrew. Andrew wants to know, since you co-wrote the Steve Young story, Steve Young Super Bowl winning Hall of Fame quarterback with the 49ers, great dynasty. And then you have this book, The Dynasty. You've seen two of the greatest NFL dynasties up close. What are some of the similarities, Andrew wants to know, and what are some of the differences between the two?
Well, Andrew, first of all, that's a great question, and I'm really appreciative that you posted it, because Steve Young and the 49ers organization were tremendously helpful to me in writing the Dynasty book about the Patriots. And the reason for that is because I spent 5 years or 4+ years working with Steve and members of the 49ers organization to write Steve's autobiography. And Steve's autobiography is essentially a book about the 49ers dynasty. And through that, I learned about how the dynasty in San Francisco was built. When it came time to write the Patriots dynasty, one of the things I was really surprised, but pleasantly surprised to learn, was that when Robert Kraft bought the Patriots in 1994, one of the very first things he did was get on a plane with his son Jonathan and fly to San Francisco and spend time with the 49ers organization, learning how they built their dynasty. He wanted to not only replicate that in New England, but make it even better. And one of his chief sources, Steve Young was the quarterback there at the time, but one of Robert's chief sources was Carmen Policy, who was the chief architect of the 49ers dynasty. He was the team president and chief executive. And a lot of times he attended the NFL owners meetings in place of Eddie DeBartolo. So as you can imagine, I then spent a lot of time interviewing Carmen Policy for the Patriots book because I had a great relationship of trust with him. I also relied on Steve Young a lot for this book. And I do some comparisons in the dynasty between the Patriots and the 49ers and see some of the similarities, but also some of the important differences. And one of the chief differences is that the Joe Montana Bill Walsh relationship, as incredible as it was in terms of the winning that it produced, there was a tremendous amount of friction in that relationship. And that relationship spins apart. That's partly what opens the door for Steve Young to step in. And so if you put that in the context of the Patriots, here's a big difference. Belichick and Brady coulda, shoulda, woulda spun apart a lot earlier, except for this big difference. It's the role of the owner in the relationship, which was handled very differently than it was handled in San Francisco. And I think Kraft's relationship with Brady is actually really similar to the relationship that Eddie DeBartolo had with Joe Montana. But Kraft's relationship with Belichick is very different than Eddie DeBartolo's relationship was with Bill Walsh. And so I think that that's what enabled him to keep them together. And so your question's a great one, and I don't want to take up too much more time, but in the book, I deal with it a lot.
A question that has come up a lot, and I've just got to get this out here. I don't know what you did with on researching this topic. I don't know if it came up on your radar. Somebody wants to know about Malcolm Butler. They think even though Bill Belichick is known for his due diligence and making sure that everything is covered, the questioner, Dexter, I believe, says, worst decision by far of Belichick's career was benching Malcolm Butler before the Philadelphia Super Bowl. Now, Dexter, this is where I disagree with you, Dexter, but I won't throw my opinion out here too much. Dexter says he thinks it cost the Patriots a Super Bowl win. I can't make that leap. I can say it did not help them, but I cannot say if you put Malcolm Butler out there, they win the game. I can't go that far. But anyway, you know, did you get any insight on why that happened with Malcolm Butler?
I did, actually, and I wrote about it in that chapter. That's a great chapter, but it's also a tough chapter for Patriots fans, anyways, because that was probably the greatest Super Bowl performance. Well, it's hard to debate between the Falcons' Super Bowl performance by Brady and then the numbers he put up in the Eagles game were just ridiculous, and yet they lost. With Butler, it's actually not as surprising as it looks if you start to look really closely at how Belichick coaches. Throughout his whole tenure in New England, he has a history of making decisions that on their face seem like, why is he doing that? It goes all the way back to replacing Bledsoe with Brady at a time when Bledsoe was the star. He's done that throughout, getting rid of Lawyer Malloy when he was at the pinnacle of his career, bringing in Rodney Harrison when he seemed to be old and beat up. He's always done this, getting rid of Adam Vinatieri. Here he decides to bench Malcolm Butler, and he puts in a young player to play in his place. Over history, when Belichick has done things like this, players have habitually played up, stepped up, performed to his expectation. This didn't happen in that Super Bowl. It didn't happen. And Belichick stuck with his decision. You could argue to the detriment of the team or to the outcome of the game. I agree with you, Michael. I would not make the leap that they would have automatically won if Butler had played. But I think the problem is the players don't understand it. And I think that's really where the tension comes in, is the locker room doesn't get it. Like, because Butler was a leader. He'd been on the field for something like 97% of the snaps. He was one of the leading tacklers. He was just one of the best defensive players they had. And the whole game he's sitting there. And so I don't want to do too much of a spoiler, but that's a subject that I did explore in that chapter, and with some input from some of the key players who were on that team that year.
Jeff, Lisa wants to know what surprised you most in this process. Now, I know that's a big question, because how many pages is in the Dynasty? I mean, it's 500 plus, right?
592.
And there are a lot. 592, almost 600. You should have just written something, another epilogue, an extra epilogue to get you to 600. But I know there's so many good stories in there, so many anecdotes, so many surprising nuggets. Is there one that stands out as a surprising one?
I was going to answer her question with one word: everything surprised me, because there was so much I didn't know when I started. I mean, you and I have had this conversation, Michael. Unlike you, who has this, 20 plus years of institutional knowledge. Tom Curran's the same way. I am not that way. I don't have institutional knowledge about these guys or this franchise. So for me, I was just learning every day. I mean, every story that I was hearing for me was like, it was new. And so to me, there was so much that was surprising. I don't know that, just shooting from the hip, I could pick one and say that was the most surprising one. But I will just say that getting to see the personal side, the human side of Robert and Jonathan Kraft, of Tom Brady, Drew Bledsoe's wife. I interviewed multiple players' wives, and I was just really struck. I loved interviewing Maura Bledsoe, just a wonderful human being, a great companion to Drew Bledsoe. You get an understanding of why Drew is such a great guy when you meet his wife. And I just felt like those were the things that I think were most eye-opening to me, is looking through the lens and seeing them as humans, not just celebrated superstar athletes and coaches and owners, but at the end of the day, they're sons and daughters of someone, their husbands or wives to someone, their fathers with kids. And so, like the scene with Teddy Bruschi and his children, when he gets in the car moments after telling Bill Belichick that he's going to retire, and he walks out of the building and he's an emotional mess. And when he gets in the car, his two little boys are sitting there and they're saying, "Daddy, what's wrong?" I mean, those are great moments. Like you don't normally get to see that. And I think that's what I was wanting to sort of showcase to people, is to really see who are these guys that are on the other side of the face mask. They're people, and they just happen to be people that are really good at one thing and that have brought a lot of drama and great moments to football fans for the last 20 years.
I want to make sure I get this questioner, give him credit, give her credit. Janet Janet has a great question about Brian Belichick. And so there's Brian Belichick and there's Steve Belichick, named after his grandfather, Bill's father, a legendary scout in college football for many years, really smart guy,
Yes.
has a book, Football Scouting Methods, that Bill's mom edited. Bill was about 9 or 10 years old. But Janet wants to know, what do you think happens with Brian Belichick after Bill hangs him up? And if not Brian, then let's add Steve to the mix too. Just what do you think about that whole dynamic with Bill coaching with his sons?
So, Janet, I appreciate the question. I hope you don't mind that I'm going to do just a slight diversion in an attempt to answer your question and go back to Steve Belichick. So instead of talking about Bill's son first, I want to talk about Bill's dad. Because Steve Belichick is an important part of this book as well. There's some great stories about him. In fact, when Steve Belichick passes away is one of the most poignant moments in the book because you get to see the conversations between Robert and Bill. When Bill informs Robert that his dad has just passed away, it's the night before a game against the New Orleans Saints, and Robert is saying, you should go to Annapolis, go be with your mom. And Bill says, no, I'm going to stay and coach the game tomorrow. And Robert's struck by that. And the next day, Bill coaches the game. And to the players, it's just another game because they don't know that his father has passed away. The only player that knows is Tom Brady. And that's because Robert had told him beforehand. And I interviewed Tom about it. And Tom said to me, this tells you the kind of thoughtful person that Tom Brady is. Tom said, at my age, I'm in my 20s. You don't think about one of your parents dying when you're in your 20s. But Bill was at an age where you do think about a parent dying. And he talked about how it caused Tom to really do some hard thinking. And he was watching how Bill conducted himself that day, because after the game in the locker room, when all the players were huddled up, Bill told them that his dad had died the night before. And for most of the players, I'd probably say all the players in that locker room, it was the first time they'd ever seen Coach Belichick vulnerable. And he speaks, and then Robert steps into the circle and hands Bill a game ball. So normally the coach gives out the game ball. This day, the owner gives out the game ball to the coach. It's a very emotional moment between Belichick and Kraft, and you can tell how much Belichick appreciates the love and affection coming from the owner. Now, fast forward a couple days to the funeral service down in Annapolis. Bill Belichick delivers a eulogy for his father. It's very emotional. But then he turns attention to his mom, who's sitting there, and he's talking about how she was the strength in the house. She really raised two coaches, her husband, Stephen Belichick, and her son. And so when you talk about what's going to happen to Bill's sons, I don't know. Michael doesn't know. None of us know. But his sons are really just like Bill in the sense that they're sons of a coach who this is his life. Stephen Belichick lived to coach football. It was all he did. One of my favorite stories in the book is when he was a coach at Navy, and President Kennedy announced in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was going to be a blockade. And when that was announced on television in the locker room, Steve Belichick's like, don't those guys know we got Pitt this weekend? I mean, that's how he was. And it's just so great. And it tells you who Bill is. And so I think Bill's sons, they love their dad. Bill's a great father. They have this close connection to him, and football's the glue. And so I don't know, but I suspect that both of them are going to be coaching probably for the rest of their lives.
And when you think about great coaches, I always say this, great coaches are great teachers. Bill Belichick is not just the son of a coach. He's the son of two teachers. Because his mother was a teacher, taught languages, a woman who loves words. That's where he got his love of reading, from his mom. Stacks of the New Yorker in the basement of their home in Annapolis. Loves great writing. So two great teachers for Bill Belichick. Bill Belichick, a great teacher and a coach. And I think his sons will be teachers / Coaches, let me squeeze in one more. Squeeze in one more, Jeff.
Sure.
Light just came on here. That's my warning. The light. Last question. A questioner wants to know, is Tom Brady really as humble as he appears to be?
That is a great question and an easy one for me to answer. And I would answer it, yes. I witnessed that, up close and personal. He is, look, I'll tell this story. It's just an indication of the kind of guy he is. One of the times that I went to interview him, I had injured my back a couple days before the interview, badly enough that it was actually really hard for me to get in my car in Waterford, Connecticut, and drive up to the stadium where I was supposed to interview Tom. I was in a lot of pain, and the chiropractor hadn't been able to relieve it. And I was there to interview Tom, and when he walked in, he could see that I was uncomfortable, and I didn't want to sit down for the interview. I was going to stand up because my back was bothering me so much. And instead of going into the interview, he started asking me questions as if he were the doctor. And he was asking me where the pain was, what it felt like, how it happened. And within 5 minutes, he says, I know exactly what you need. And he started explaining what was going on with the muscles and everything else. And at the end of the interview, he then took out his phone and he said, I'm going to put you in touch with Alex. You need to see Alex. Alex Guerrero is his, body guru, his trainer, his partner really in the TB12 method. And he literally reached out to him with me standing there and connected me with him and got me into the clinic so Alex could treat me. It's just, he doesn't need to do any of that. He's got a million things to do. I'm a journalist working on a project, but it just showed me something about like who he is as a man. Like he actually cared. And then, check, make sure everything's all right, everything working out, which it was. And I saw example after example like that about him. He's very down to earth. For a guy who's on top of the world, he's very grounded. And I think that grounding started with the way he was raised, but he's a family man. He's very self-deprecating about how good of a father and a husband he is, but he's all about being a good father and a good husband. And he's a great quarterback. The fact that he's as good of a husband and father as he is, just think of this. What other celebrity can you think of who occupied the top of the mountain in whatever industry they were in, music, acting, sports, 20 years as the biggest star and no scandal, no controversy, no embarrassing behaviors that would bring shame on the league or the team? Tom has walked the walk for 20 years. And I think that's just proof in the way that he's conducted himself wearing a Patriots uniform.
So I'm glad we stopped there, because then somebody's saying, Deflategate, ask him about Deflategate. And I'm not doing it because I was on sports radio for 13 years in Boston. And it seemed like I talked about Deflategate for 13 years. It wasn't that, but we talked about Deflategate a lot. And I got to admit, I was obsessed with it after a while. I read the Wells report, and I read the Wells report in context, and the commissioner's appeals hearing. That was some good stuff in there. Anyway, the book is called The Dynasty. The author is Jeff Benedict. We are fortunate that he is a New Englander. He is a great writer. He's a great man. He's a friend of mine. I'm proud to call him a friend. I've learned a lot from him. Jeff, thank you for allowing us to spend some time with you this evening, for letting us come into your office. The Garde Arts Center is your home away from home. So thank you, Jeff. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Michael. And I mean that as a friend. There's no one else I would have rather had do this. So I'm glad you had the time or made the time. And I'm glad that a lot of people that are friends of mine and family that live here that are watching tonight got to meet you and see you and have you participate. So thank you.
Nice to meet you all. Nice to spend some time with you on a Tuesday night. Pick up The Dynasty. Support the author. Come on. Give him some support. Give him some love. He is a New York Times best-selling author. You got to keep that going. David Halberstam had a streak for a while. I lost count. Jeff, I think it was like 14 straight New York Times bestsellers, something ridiculous. So
you're making me tired, Michael.
We got to catch up. We got to catch up with Halberstam. Hey, everybody, the Dynasty, Jeff Benedict, thank you so much. For Jeff Benedict, I'm Michael Holley, and for everybody at the Garde Arts Center, thank you so much for a wonderful night.
Thank you, Michael.